Hey guys, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be using two stamp sets, both by Simon Says Stamp. The first is Egg-stra Sweet Easter, and the other one is Easter Wishes, which is actually on sale right now. So I'll leave all of the supplies below if you want to go check it out. It's like half price right now. So I'm making a long card here, and I'm starting off with a panel of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and this is cut down to 8 1/4 by 3 1/2, which will be slightly smaller than my card base itself. And I started just by taking the stamps that I planned on using and kind of arranging those to see how I wanted to place these down. I knew this was too large of a panel here to fit in my MISTI without, you know, moving it around too much, which I'm too lazy to do. So I figured this was the next best thing. Once I had the stamps laid out the way I wanted them, I'm going to go ahead and start stamping those out with Blackout ink by Ink on 3, because this is a Copic safe ink and we're going to be doing Copic coloring for the entire panel. These are really super intricate images, so I didn't want to have to cut masks for them. So I'm going to create my background as far as my sky and my grass and all of that with my Copic markers. So I'm just kind of scattering these around, and I should have left a little bit more room between these two little chicks off to the right-hand side, but I didn't, and it is what it is. I wanted to place some flowers in between there, but I just didn't leave myself enough room, and again, I just didn't want to have to do any masking. So I did take a few of those little tiny flowers that come in the larger stamp set and kind of place those throughout the bottom portion of my card panel. And then I took an EK Success journaling pen, which is a Copic safe pen, and just continued those little blades of grass that are part of some of those images. And I just continued those throughout the entire bottom portion of my card. So next we'll move on to the background, and I'm going to start off with some trees on either side just to kind of break up the background a little bit. I'm going to start off with my lightest color, and I'm just basically drawing out the shape of a tree with the branches on either side as if they're kind of hanging off the side of the card. And these do not have to be perfect. They're just basic shapes here. But I am going to do a little bit of shading. So I'm going to place my darkest color just pretty much on the left-hand side of the tree trunk and on each one of those branches. And I'm kind of just letting this flick out because branches are always teeny tiny on the ends of them. So I'm kind of just going with the shape of those branches. Then I'm going to bring in my midtone, and I'm just going to extend those areas out a little bit further, and leaving just the right-hand side or the top portion of each of those branches, depending on which direction they're faced, for that highlight color again. I'll bring in that E21, and I'm going to go over pretty much the entire thing and just get these colors to blend. And I'm going right down to the base of where my grass starts, where we kind of drew in those blades of grass. I'm going right down to the bottom. So I'll finish off my trees afterwards, but next we're going to move on to some clouds in the background. So I'm going to start off with my C1, and I'm just basically drawing basic shapes of clouds throughout the background. This way it'll be easy to cover if I mess up. Next, I'm going to go in with my C1, and very lightly with just the tip of my marker, I'm going over the bottom portion of each one of the clouds and the top where it kind of dips in. So like a fluffy cloud where those fluffy parts dip in a little bit. I'm just basically putting a V. And once that C3 was down, I'm going to bring in my B91. And I'm just going to go over that C3, those areas with the C3, and just make those areas just a little bit thicker so that it's not completely gray. I'm bringing in a little bit of a blue tone to it. There is a lot of gray in this B91 anyway. It's kind of a grayish blue, but I do want to bring in a little bit of color. Next, I'll go back in with my C1, and I'm just going to flick these areas out, leaving a majority of these clouds still white. I'm leaving a whole lot of white space here, but this is just going to add some dimension and some shading. To get rid of those flick lines, I'm going to bring in my colorless blender, and I'm going to quickly go over the center portion of each one of those clouds just to kind of get rid of those flick lines and make those colors blend a little bit, but I'm going over it very quickly. So next we'll move on to the sky, and this is where things started to get a little crazy. I'm going to start off with my BG10 just on the bottom portion of my sky. And I have this sped up by quite a bit because it does take a little bit of time to fill in such a large area. But I'm just using this on the bottom portion. I wanted to have my sky be like 3 different tones, and I ended up changing that because I hated it. But the BG10 will just be on the bottom portion, and I'm kind of just filling in between my little images. And then once I get to the top, I'm flicking that out just to make my blending easier. Next, I'm going to go in with my B00, and I'm going to go for the middle part of my sky here, filling in between all of my branches and around all of my clouds. And I typically work in little sections here just to make it a little bit easier for me in order to go around all the images, including those clouds. So you want to make sure that you keep that gray area of the clouds so that you keep that dimension. When I get towards the bottom where we had that BG10, I'm flicking down so that those 2 colors can kind of blend together. They're very close to each other anyway, so I typically don't have a problem blending these 2. Once I had the entire top portion, or the middle portion, I should say, of the sky filled in with that B00, I'm going to go back and do it all again because alcohol markers leave those little streaks there. Once you add another layer, those streaks should kind of go away. So again, working in small little sections to keep it easy on myself, trying to go in the same direction with my marker each and every time. And you will want to make sure that your marker is nice and filled. You don't want a dry marker. You will not get good results at all with that. So once that was done, I'm going to flick up so that my next color will blend nicely. And it didn't because I just didn't pick a good color here, but I wanted the top portion to be a little bit on the purplish bluish side, which I probably should have used a BV marker, but I ended up bringing in my V01 and filled in the top portion of my sky here, again, going around the clouds and the branches, and then flicking that down in order to try to get this to blend with the B00. I hated it. Normally, if I do a sky with ink blending with Distress inks, I will throw in a purple there, and I usually love my results. I didn't love my results with the Copics at all. So I attempted to kind of fix this by just covering it up with the B00. And the B00 was just too light of a color. And I went over this a couple of times, but that purple was just seeping through. The Copics are transparent, where Distress Oxide inks are more opaque, so you would be able to cover it up a little bit better with the Distress Oxides, but with Copics, I wasn't getting great results here. That purple just kept shining through, and it just did not look right. So what I ultimately ended up doing is bringing in a darker blue marker and covering up that entire top portion of my sky and flicking down with that. So I'm going to use my B02, which is just a little bit darker than the B00, but I'm going to go over that entire purple area. Again, just being careful to go around my branches and my clouds and flicking down so that I can get the B00 to blend well with that. I'll go back in with my B00 to get those flick lines to kind of blend together and go over some of those areas where the 2 colors kind of meet, because there is enough of a difference where they're just not going to blend seamlessly on their own like the first 2 color combinations did. So again, just being careful to go around those clouds, leaving that gray area so that we could have that dimension within the clouds. So once my sky was finally done, I wasn't overly happy with it, but it is what it is. We're going to move on to finishing up the trees. So I'm going to bring in some RV markers here, and I'm just placing dots all around the tree. And I'm just using the tip of my marker. You can see that my marker is straight up and down. And the lighter RV marker just blended in, especially over that B02. So I brought in the RV25, which is quite a bit darker. And that was, you could see that a lot better, but it still wasn't quite dark enough because I was going over such a dark blue color. So I ended up bringing in the RV09, which is a pretty dark pink. But that actually worked out a lot better because you could actually see it, especially on the top portion. And I did go back in with that lighter color to try to get these dots to kind of blend in with one another. Also brought in a YG marker just to add a few dots randomly to make it look as if there was some leaves mixed in with these flowers or buds that are on the tree. I didn't like it that with the tree trunk just bare. So I ended up adding the dots right over the tree trunk as well because there would naturally be flowers and leaves there too. So once that was done, I'm going to move on to the grass, and I'm just going to fill in the entire area here, including the little blades of grass that are kind of sticking up with my lightest color, which is the YG13. Just being careful going around all of my images. This is not a huge area, so you don't need to do a whole lot of blending. Next, I'm going to bring in the G09, which is quite a bit darker than that YG13. And I'm just going to be adding some shadows underneath each one of my objects and each one of my little critters there. And then blending that out a little bit with the YG17. And I know I'm a little bit off camera. I'm in a new craft room and I'm having a very hard time getting used to it. Even though it's all my same stuff, it's my same desk, it's my same shelves, I'm still just having a very hard time getting used to sitting differently and things like that. So I have my camera mounted differently than I normally did. And obviously this is a much longer card than what I usually make. So it's kind of difficult to make sure that I'm within camera view the entire time. So I'm going to move on to the coloring of the critters. And I do have this sped up a little bit just because this video would have been like over an hour long if I didn't. So I'm going right in with my darkest color for this little sheep here. For the little face, I am adding some shading underneath where the wool is kind of hanging over her face and on where her back legs are behind her front legs. And then I'm just using the illustration itself and the details within the illustration to kind of add some texture to the wool. Blended that out with the W3 and then decided to add a little bit more texture to the wool itself. So I'm going to go back in with the W3, add a few little C marks, quick little squigglies with my W1 and W3, and that added a lot more texture to the wool. Next, I added some R20 to the inside of the ears and the little nose, and then I used those same warm gray markers for, I guess, the hooves. Do sheep have hooves? That's what we're going to call them. I use the same color combination. So next, moving on to the bunny, I'm going to be using some E markers for him, and I typically color my Easter bunnies white, but this time I wanted to kind of change it up a little bit and color him a light brown. So I went in with my lightest color just to map out the darkest areas before going in with that darkest color. The shading is going to be mainly on the left-hand side of his face, but just a little bit on the right as well. On the base part of his little ears, underneath his chin, where his hind leg is kind of hanging over the rest of his body, and then just a little bit on the bottom portion, so where like his hind legs would be. Going to extend that out each time with the mid-tone colors, and I also put a little bit of shading above his little nose too, where his little, I guess it would be like a little snout, I don't know, but there would be some dimension on his face there. So I just added a little bit of shading there. And then finally going back in with the lightest color to blend all of these areas out. I wanted him to have a little white tail, so I brought in my C3 and my C1 just to add a little bit of shading to the base of the tail, but still leaving a little bit of white space so that it would still appear to be white. So next we'll move on to the little chicks. And I'm going to use some Y markers and a YR marker for my shadow color. Just putting a little bit of shading on either side of his little face and where that egg is kind of hanging, or he's kind of tucked in the egg actually. Blending that out with the Y38, then the Y35, and then back to the Y04. I'm going to show you this other chick here just because I shaded this one a little bit different, but the two little chicks that are in that little wagon there, I won't bother to show you because I use the same color combination. For this one, it's a little bit larger of an area to fill in, so I was having a little bit of trouble blending the Y35 with the Y04 because the Y04 is such a bright yellow that I ended up using the tip-to-tip method to get these colors to blend a little bit, where I just take the tip of the Y04 and touch the tip of the Y35 and then blend that out as I move onto the paper into the highlight area, if that makes any sense. So you basically are using 5 different colors rather than just 4. I did color their little beaks solid with the YR68. And for the little wagon, I'm going to move on to some E30 markers. And I'm just going to put a little bit of shading on the left-hand side and underneath that top portion of the wagon where it would kind of hang over the bottom portion, paying attention that you can still see some of the wagon between the little wheel pieces, between the openings of the wheel. So I'm adding a little bit of shading off to the right-hand side for that as well, blending that out with the E33 and then finally moving back into the E31 to blend all of those areas out. As you can see, I have a little visitor here. For the wheel, I'm bringing in some E70 markers, and I know it's hard to see the cap. Frankie's taking up the very little room that I have to work on this card. And I just added a little bit of shading off to the left-hand side of the wheel and on the right-hand side of the other side of the wheel, just to kind of make this look round. And blended that out with the E74 and then back to that E70. I used the mid-tone for the middle portion, or whatever they're called. The openings of the wheel, I guess, whatever. So next I'm going to move on to all of the other things, the eggs, the jelly beans, and the little bow on the sheep and the little flowers. So I'm going to speed this up even more because I kind of use the same, just a few different color combinations throughout all of them to kind of keep it consistent, and it saved me time by not having to dig through all of my Copics to find different color combinations that I wanted to use. I'm pretty much sticking to just the 3 color combination here. For the jelly beans, I concentrated the shading being on the bottom portion where it's kind of like, where it's indented in, I guess. It's shaped like a bean. For the eggs, I'm concentrating my highlight being in the center, being they are round objects. You always want to make sure that you have a center highlight for all round objects, but also paying attention that if one egg is behind another, that would also cast a shadow. For the eggs that have like little polka dots on them, I am coloring directly over them. I'm going to go ahead and fill those in later by adding just a little bit of dimension to the card. I am coloring these stripes individually. Again, just using 3 color combinations. For the egg that is kind of laying down, I'm still concentrating on a center highlight, but I'm putting a little bit more shading on the bottom or where it's touching the ground, just because the top portion would have a little bit more light than the bottom. But I am still keeping a center highlight. So moving on to the leaves here, I'm just coloring these in solid. They are really, really teeny tiny. For the little tulip, I used an RV combination, but for the other little, I guess they're maybe little daisies, I didn't do any shading on these. For little teeny tiny areas, don't feel the need that you have to use different color combinations for everything. If they're small enough, there's nothing wrong with going in with just one color. If you feel that you have to do some shading, which sometimes I do, I will go in with two colors. But in this case, I didn't even worry about one laying in front of another and adding a shadow there. I just went in with that solid color. So I'm just finishing up. I did use a BG combination, which I was trying to avoid using because I didn't want to blend in with my sky. But by bringing in the BG 13, it was dark enough where it looked like a completely different color than what I used for the sky, or the bottom portion of the sky anyway. So just finishing up my little eggs here and my flowers. And once that was done, that is pretty much the coloring, and we're going to move on to the sentiment now. So I'm using one of the sentiments from that larger stamp set, as well as the sending die, also by Simon Says Stamp. And here I'm just kind of layering it onto another card panel that will be the same size as my card base. And just trying to see if I wanted to color that with a border or whether I just wanted to leave it white. Ultimately, I decided to use a RV marker, and I honestly don't know which one I used. I just pulled one out that I still had sitting on my desk that I used in the card. So either way, it will match the card. I scribbled some of that onto a card base that I have sitting there because I know it's a heavyweight card stock, which you'll want to use. I die cut the word die twice. One I just cut out of white cardstock, again, heavyweight. And then the other time I will lay this onto this little area that I had scribbled and run that through my Gemini again. And I'm just using a Cricut tool to kind of poke this out because this is a pretty intricate die. Now I should have cut this out of I should have cut them both out of pink, because once I layered these together, you could kind of see the white showing, but I'll fix that. I wanted the back panel there to match my sentiment. So I'm going to take that same RV marker and I'm just coloring in all four sides of my layered panel, I guess, just to give this a border that will match everything else that's going on in the card. And then I'm going to go ahead and glue my two little sentiments together. And I'm using Tombow Mono Multi Glue here. You can use a double-sided adhesive before running this through the die cutting machine, but I found that wet glue works best for me just because it gives me a little bit more time to kind of maneuver these letters together, especially with a die like this. This is really intricate. I ended up taking that RV marker, and I'm kind of off camera here, but I went around all of the sides so that none of that white was showing through from that first word that we had die cut through. So for the rest of my sentiment, I'm going to use one from that larger stamp set. And again, using my RV marker to scribble onto this heavyweight card base because it's sitting here. So I'm going to use it, treating that with my anti-static tool. And I ended up having to scribble a little bit more of that marker down because it just wasn't enough at first. But I will go ahead and stamp this out with a Versamark ink. And then I'll sprinkle on some white Hero Arts embossing powder and heat set that. You'll just want to make sure that your heat gun is nice and heated up before bringing that to the paper. And once that was heat set, I'll go ahead and cut this down into a strip using my tonic trimmer. And I cut the strip pretty much just slightly larger than the sentiment itself, just because I knew my sentiment was going to take up a whole lot of room, and for a longer card like this, I don't have a whole lot of room to work with. So I kind of laid everything out to make sure everything was going to fit the way I wanted to. I glued down the main panel to my card base flat down with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue, and then use that same adhesive to glue down the die cut word. And then I will pop up the little Easter Wishes sentiment strip with my Scotch foam tape. I like to use the wet glue for sentiments because, like, as you just saw, I placed that sending word a little bit too diagonal, I guess you could say. So it gave me a few minutes to move that around the way I wanted it. So once my sentiment was down, I'm going to take my white gel pen to add some reflections or some details to mainly the eggs, because these are round objects. So these would be mainly what would have a reflection. I also took my Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen to add some shimmer to all of the little jelly beans and all of the Easter eggs, and to fill in those areas where I had kind of just colored over those little polka dots, and also to add a little bit more dimension. I'm going to use some Nuvo drops in all different colors here, and I'm honestly just using the backing of my Scotch foam tape as my scrap paper to squeeze a little bit out of that bottle, just to be sure that I don't have any air bubbles before bringing that to my card. So I'm just showing you the colors that I used here that kind of matched the rest of the colors that I used in the background, and I'm just filling those in, and that is it. That is the card for today. As always, I will leave a list of all of the supplies I used down in the description box. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.